Hello, my name is Randy, and today me and my group will be talking about the Chinese immigrant experience, and we'll be talking about three different areas of Chinese immigrant experience. So to start off with the introduction, the Chinese experience throughout the 19th and 20th century has been characterized by many factors, some of which have been discrimination, racism, and systemic barriers. Despite these advantages towards the Chinese, they were able to form tight-knit communities that would thrive, and that the Chinese contributed greatly to the nation's development through notable impacts on society and economics. Chinese immigrants have encompassed the spirit of resilience and the continual struggle for acceptance in American society. Some of the themes that we will be discussing in this PowerPoint would be discrimination and how Chinese immigrants face systemic boundaries that led to many racist and prejudiced laws and many limited opportunities within this country, how they contributed to the nation's wealth. Many Chinese immigrants have contributed to the nation's growth, especially in the railroad sectors in the 1850s, agriculture within California, and many other sectors of American economy. Like I had mentioned a little bit before, resilience is one of the reoccurring themes in immigration history. Chinese immigrants have had to overcome many obstacles and boundaries, demonstrating determination, adaptability, and navigating many barriers, such as language barriers, culture barriers, and other barriers that could be potentially in place for them. Community ties are also one of the central themes. The Chinese immigrants build very strong communities throughout the United States in Chinatowns all over cities, Seattle, Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Francisco, mainly on the West Coast, but a lot of these Chinese oriented towns started popping up, and it was a place where they could basically seek support and have a sense of belonging in a new and unfamiliar environment. Another cultural or another theme is the cultural aspect. Chinese immigrants have contributed greatly to the rich and complex diversity of this nation while incorporating American traditions and their own traditions. And then advocacy for equality. Um, this isn't something that's uniquely Chinese, but it's something that a lot of minority groups reach for. And it's just that Chinese immigrants have historically always advocated for equal rights, civil rights, and equality within the American political landscape and continue to fight in these movements. Another slide that I wanted to include was a timeline of what we would be talking about. So, starting with the 1850s, Chinese immigration begins to California with the gold mining and the boom in the railroad industry. A lot of Chinese immigrants saw this as a way of basically creating a new life for themselves. So, they started immigrating in the 1850s. And then about 30 years later, around 1882, we see the passage of the first Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the most restrictive legislation passed in US history. And then shortly after that is followed by the Gary Act, which basically extended the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act. Then we go to 1910, and it was at this time that Angel Island was opened up, and this was the stopping point for many migrants coming through on the West Coast. And basically, Angel Island contributed greatly to the Chinese experience by showcasing the struggles they endured upon arrival. Many of the times they would write on the walls with poems or on the floors, and it basically carried on this oral and written down history of Angel Island and how it affected Chinese immigrants, and just not just Chinese, but also Japanese and many other minority groups that passed through there. The next era would be the 1940-43 with World War II. Angel Island closes down in 1940, and then in 1943, the Exclusion Act was finally repealed. But although it was repealed, it still was leaving a stain on the nation's past and their treatment towards minority groups. The act was in place for about 60 years, so it left a pretty negative stain, and they wanted to have better relations with the Chinese during the war. And then the period of 1965 to now, um, with the Nationality Act of 1965, it basically got rid of the national quota system and a lot of restrictions that were still in place towards the Chinese, even after the Exclusion Act was repealed, because there was still some prejudice and racism left over. And then even in recent times with the Anti-Asian Hate Act of 2021, um, shows that there has been an improvement towards Chinese immigrants, but that they still face a lot of prejudice and other forms of discrimination. And then my group will discuss the rest. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria Perez, and I'm going to be reading the first argument for the Chinese experience presentation. In the 19th century, there was the first wave of Chinese immigrants that migrated to the United States. Many Chinese immigrants faced many struggles when they came to California seeking better opportunities. The Chinese were a big part of building the railroads and working the gold mines after the labor shortage. Upon their arrival and settlement to America, they were instantly racially discriminated against and violently attacked by the American natives, and the U.S. didn't do much to protect them. Due to their appearance and the way they dress, they would stand out amongst the others. The majority of Chinese immigrants that came were peasants. These people had no choice and were running away from poverty in their own country. They had nothing to hold them back in their own country, and when they found out about the gold rush, they believed it was a great opportunity for them to work and send money back to their families. When the news came to them about the gold rush, they didn't think twice about coming to work the gold mines. As more Chinese immigrants came to America, racial tensions increased. These people were exposed to racial attacks, and some were even killed. But this didn't stop them from doing their work. Compared to the wages in their country, they were earning more money, working the gold mines, even though they were exploited and receiving lower wages. The Americans began to feel threatened when the Chinese were doing their jobs and felt they were being driven out of their own jobs. Around 1860, the Chinese also worked helping build the railroads. Building the railroads was important in American history because it led to economic growth. The Chinese workers were treated unfairly. Their living conditions were horrible, and they worked very long hours. The Chinese immigrants played a big part in building the railroad's history, even though they weren't recognized for it. Between the years 1870 and 1880, Chinese immigrants were beaten and murdered. Many Chinese lost their lives, homes, and businesses as well.
Okay, for our second argument in our presentation for the Chinese experience in America, I will be talking about what Chinese immigrants went through during the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I'm going to be talking about examples of people who were mistreated, what the Exclusion Act is, and I would like to briefly talk about Angel Island, which is a big entryway for Chinese immigrants and Asian and other Asian American immigrants for entry into the United States. So first, I would like to go the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was approved on May 6, 1882. This act was in place up until 1943, which was around the same time the United States had repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act because China was a member of the Allied nations during World War II. The Chinese Exclusion Act was one of the first significant laws that prohibited immigration to the United States. So, the main objective of this act was to put a 10-year ban on Chinese laborers being able to immigrate to the United States. Of course, that 10-year ban was extended. many people don't know that the Chinese Exclusion Act was also affecting Chinese immigrants that were already in the United States. And a couple examples of how they were affected is by having requirements that the Chinese had to meet. So whenever a Chinese immigrant left the United States, to be able to come back, they would have to get certification from the Chinese government to be able to re-enter into the United States. And of course, that was um, really hard because you would have to ask the government permission pretty much to leave the country and enter the United States. And Congress also refused to give state and federal courts the rights to grant Chinese immigrants citizenships. And switching over to Angel Island, of course, it was a main entry port into the United States for the majority of the immigrants in Asia, including the Chinese immigrants. And Angel Island sat near San Francisco and it opened in 1910. Angel Island is also well known because of its really unfairness to the Chinese immigrants and because of the inhumane holding facilities that the Chinese immigrants had to stay days or up into or months sometimes until they were cleared to leave the holding facilities and enter the United States. And one example that really that was really wrong is a recorded data from a Chinese woman named Kwok Shi. And her experience was really interesting because she was detained for 600 nights. So she was detained from September 1916 up until her release date, which was on April 1918. So pretty much 2 years within a holding facility. However, migrating to the United States became even more difficult for immigrants, and especially the Chinese immigrants, because including the Immigration Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, this made Chinese immigrants really limited into the numbers they could go into. So, the Immigration Act was implemented on May 26, 1924, and the act was meant to restrict the number of immigrants entering the United States using a national origins quota.
I did the third argument. Chinese immigrants faced discrimination and prejudice during the 19th and the 20th centuries due to factors like cultural differences, economic competition, and xenophobia. Advocacy for equality was necessary to address systemic injustice, secure civil rights, and challenge discriminatory policies such as the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States. The discrimination towards Chinese people had a far reaching effect on various cultures. It perpetrated harmful stereotypes and reinforced racial prejudice. These acts limited opportunities for Chinese individuals, hindering the progress of diverse cultural groups. Some examples of like the bad treatment Chinese immigrants had were that there was anti-Chinese riots and attacks, which were unfortunately prevalent during the 19th and the 20th centuries. One notorious example is the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885, where a mob of white and European immigrant miners attacked Chinese miners in the Wyoming, resulting in numerous deaths and the expulsion of hundreds of Chinese from the town. There were other similar incidents which occurred in other parts of the United States, with Chinese communities often being targets of violence. These events reflect a dark chapter in history when anti Chinese sentiment manifested in brutal and unjust actions. The Los Angeles Massacre of 1871 was a violent incident that targeted the Chinese community in Los Angeles, California. On October 24, 1871, a mob of about 500 white and Hispanic residents attacked the Chinese population in the city's Chinatown. The attack was triggered by economic competition, as some white and Hispanic workers resented Chinese immigrants for their perceived role in driving down wages. During the violence, around 19 Chinese immigrants were killed, and the majority of these Chinese community homes and businesses were looted and destroyed. The authorities did little to intervene or protect the Chinese residents. The Los Angeles massacre is another tragic example of anti-Chinese sentiment and violence that Chinese immigrants face. Another thing was the Gary Act of 1892, which extended and strengthened the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The act made the exclusion indefinite, further solidifying anti-Chinese sentiments and restrictions. The Gary Act was not repealed until the Magnuson Act of 1943, which marked a shift in U.S. immigration policy during the World War II. The act required all Chinese residents, whether they were newly arrived or already living in the country, to register with the federal government to obtain a certificate of residence. It also extended the exclusion period for an additional 10 years and imposed stricter enforcement measures, including increased penalties and the threat of deportation for noncompliance. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act impacted Chinese immigrants by limiting the discriminatory national origin quota system. By eliminating the discriminatory quotas, the 1965 Act created more opportunities for immigrants from Asia, including China, to enter the United States, and contributed to a more diverse immigrant population and facilitated the reunification of Chinese families. After the lifting of restrictive immigration policies, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants have diversified. Many individuals are coming for education, employment opportunities, and family reunification. In recent decades, many Chinese immigrants have pursued education and employment opportunities in the United States, particularly in fields such as science, technology, and engineering, mathematics.
So, after looking at the three different areas of Chinese immigrant experiences, we wanted to include a short 3-minute video clip that summarizes the experience of Chinese immigrants.
In fact, one of the violence in Los Angeles in 1871 when two men who were essentially loafers, two white men, one of the worst instances we know of violence occurred in Los Angeles in 1871 when two men who were essentially loafers, two white men, got caught pretty much in the crossfire of a Tong dispute. And in retaliation for being attacked in this, for being really caught in the crossfire, a white mob attacked LA's Chinatown, burned it to the ground, lynched and killed probably about 22 score Chinese. I know about 12 to 20 Chinese. And they were so eager to get their belongings that they cut their fingers off to get the gold rings on their fingers. I mean, it was just horrendous, the kind of violence and the pressure these people lived under. And it was very difficult to be a Chinese immigrant in 19th century California.
Now, how extensive was violence against the Chinese, in particular arson?
Well, it was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. You see the first violence against the Chinese happening in the gold fields of California in the 1850s. You see officials, white law enforcement officials turning a blind eye to it. For a very long time, Chinese could not testify against whites in court, which just meant open season on Chinese immigrants, because if you had two Chinese witnesses to a murder, then you had no court case if you didn't have any white witnesses. And so the violence was extreme against them. Their arson was incredible. Many Chinatowns were burned to the ground.
How does that change in the 20th century?
Well, the violence begins to recede. And what you see instead is discrimination, polite discrimination, if there is such a thing. You don't see the kind of violence that you saw in the 19th century, simply because a lot of city officials wouldn't tolerate it any longer. Discrimination was fine, but violence was disruptive to entire communities. And so in the 20th century, you see incredible job discrimination, you see incredible housing discrimination, educational discrimination against Chinese Americans. Many of them are forced to attend segregated schools in their communities. Many Asian American children in general are forced to attend segregated schools. Very few have job opportunities. And in fact, there was a very famous essay contest in the 1930s in which college educated Chinese Americans, kids who'd gone to Stanford and Harvard, they wrote these essays Does my future lie in China or America? Because if they stayed in America, they knew they would have no opportunities. And yet, by the 1920s, you see this interesting phenomenon, especially in California, as you see more Asian immigrants from Japan and migrants from the Philippines come in to do agricultural work. And as the Japanese, who have a strong homeland government, unlike the Chinese, they're more prone to strike because they have the power to do so. They're more prone to ask for better wages and better treatment. A lot of farmers and other Californians begin to wax nostalgic for what they call the old time Chinese who knew their place. Weren't they great? The old time Chinese knew their place because if they dared speak out, they could be murdered and their homeland government couldn't do anything. And so you see this strange nostalgia, which you also see in terms of Chinatowns becoming tourist attractions. It would have been.
Okay, so that concludes our presentation on Chinese immigrant experiences. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.